History is a vast and endlessly turning tapestry, woven with the stories of people born to rule and those who have had rule violently thrust upon them. It's a chronicle of power, ambition, betrayal, and survival, where the fates of nations are decided by the strength and weakness of individuals. But even in this grand and often brutal narrative, a library of human experience filled with astonishing tales, you will rarely find a story as profoundly dramatic, as heartbreaking, and as inspiring as that of the child who inherited a kingdom trembling on the very verge of collapse. A young girl who was forced, by the cruel and intricate machinations of politics and war, to marry the very man sent to destroy her homeland and everything she held dear. This isn't a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, where a beleaguered princess finds salvation in a royal marriage to a charming prince. This is the stark, unvarnished, and very real story of Anne of Brittany. It is a chronicle stripped of all fantasy, a raw look at the true nature of power in a world where a woman's worth was so often measured by her marriageability. She was a girl who became a duchess at the tender age of 11, a bride in a forced and loveless union at 14, and a queen of a rival nation completely and utterly against her will. Hers is a staggering story of personal sacrifice, a life where her wedding invitation was, in fact, a surrender treaty written in the cold, unforgiving language of coercion. It is a tale where the staggering price of her people's survival was her own freedom, her own body, and her own heart. Imagine, for a moment, being just 12 years old. At that age, your world should be one of lessons, friendships, and the slow, gentle discovery of who you are and what you might become. Now, imagine that at that same age, you are simultaneously the most powerful and the most profoundly vulnerable person in your entire country. This was the precarious, terrifying reality for Anne of Brittany. On one hand, she was the sovereign Duchess of Brittany, the inheritor of one of Europe's richest and most coveted duchies, a land of immense strategic importance and staggering wealth. But on the other hand, she was a child, an orphan, grappling with the fresh, raw grief of losing her father, and suddenly, the number one target of the most powerful and predatory king in the Christian world. The throne she inherited wasn't just a gilded chair and a heavy crown. It was a crisis embodied, a position of unparalleled peril. It was a beacon that drew the sharks of European politics closer, each one circling, smelling blood in the water, and sensing an opportunity for the taking. Her duchy was a prize, and she was the key to claiming it. And her greatest enemy, the King of France, didn't just want her resource-rich lands. He wanted her. He and his advisors understood with chilling clarity that she was the living, breathing lock to which they needed the key. To possess her was to possess Brittany forever. To save her homeland from being completely erased from the map, to prevent her culture and her people from being swallowed whole by a larger, more ravenous kingdom, she had to face down an impossible choice. She had to become the wife of the man whose singular ambition was to be her country's executioner. Born in the year 1477, within the ancient, imposing walls of the Grand Castle of Nantes, Anne's entire world was shaped and defined by the Duchy of Brittany. This was no mere province of France, content to exist in its shadow. It was a fiercely proud and stubbornly independent land, a nation unto itself that pulsed with its own unique identity. For centuries, Brittany had been a land apart, a rugged, granite peninsula jutting out into the wild Atlantic, defined by its own ancient language, its own proud army, and its own complex system of laws. It had tenaciously, and often violently, resisted the enormous gravitational pull of its colossal neighbor, the Kingdom of France. The Bretons saw themselves as just that, Bretons, not French. Their identity was carved into the very stones of their castles and the cadence of their language. Anne's father, the weary but resolute Duke Francis II, understood the fragility of their cherished independence better than anyone. His reign was a constant, draining battle against French encroachment. He lived with a gnawing political anxiety that festered at the heart of his court. He had no sons. In an era that demanded male heirs to secure a dynasty, this was seen as a fatal, undeniable weakness. But Brittany, in its enduring distinctiveness, held one crucial difference from France, a legal tradition that would change the course of its history. While the French crown strictly followed Salic law, a rigid code that forbade any woman from ruling, Brittany's own traditions allowed a daughter to inherit the ducal crown. So, from her earliest years, Anne was not merely trained to be a decorative princess, skilled in embroidery, music, and courtly manners. She was meticulously groomed to be a sovereign. Her education was a formidable thing, a curriculum designed to build a ruler, going far beyond what even the most privileged noblewomen of her time received. She was immersed in Latin, the universal language of diplomacy, theology, and law. She studied the intricate, often treacherous, art of statecraft, learning how to read the subtle currents of power. And she learned the delicate, dangerous dance of diplomacy right at her father's side, observing every negotiation, every treaty, every carefully chosen word, storing it all away. She would need every ounce of that education, and she would need it far sooner than anyone could have possibly imagined. Across the border, the French crown, guided by the cunning and utterly ruthless regent, Anne of Brittany, a woman known as the least foolish woman in France, saw Brittany's succession situation as the perfect, long-awaited opportunity. This was their chance to finally swallow the troublesome, defiant duchy and complete the map of their kingdom. In the year 1488, this cold ambition erupted into open warfare. French armies, a relentless and well-oiled military machine, stormed across the border and crushed the Breton forces in a decisive, brutal campaign. A defeated and heartbroken Duke Francis was forced to sign the Treaty of Louverture. It was a humiliation on paper, a catalogue of concessions, but one clause, in particular, was a masterstroke of political strangulation. It stipulated that his daughters, and her younger sister, could not marry without the explicit permission of the King of France. This treaty didn't just clip the wings of Breton diplomacy. It fastened a heavy leash around the neck of Brittany's entire future, giving its greatest enemy direct control over its very survival. The ink on the treaty was barely dry when tragedy struck. Just a few months later, Duke Francis II, the last great protector of his nation, died from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse. In an instant, the world shifted on its axis. Suddenly, at the tender age of 11, Anne wasn't just an heiress in waiting anymore. She was Anne, Duchess of Brittany, an orphan, a child ruler, and the last, flickering symbol of her nation's fading independence. The wolves were no longer circling. They were closing in for the kill. And the young French king, Charles VIII, was leading the pack. With a child duchess on the throne, the political landscape of Europe convulsed. The Duchy of Brittany, now led by a vulnerable girl, immediately became the epicenter of a frantic, high-stakes political chess game. Every monarch in Christendom turned their gaze towards the small, embattled duchy. As the young, unmarried ruler of a land that was both fabulously wealthy and strategically vital, and transformed overnight into the most eligible and most critical bachelorette in all of Europe. Her hand in marriage was not a romantic prize for a lucky suitor. It was the ultimate tool for national survival. Her future husband would not just be a consort, but a protector, an ally, a military commander capable of standing against the might of France. Desperate for a powerful counterweight to the looming French threat, Anne's advisors, men who had served her father and now bore the crushing weight of their nation's fate on their shoulders, frantically searched for a suitable husband. The courts of Europe buzzed with the Breton question. Emissaries were dispatched in secret, coded letters were exchanged by candlelight, and delicate proposals were floated in hushed tones. There were urgent talks with England, a traditional rival of France always keen to disrupt its ambitions. Negotiations were opened with the rising power of Spain, whose monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were masters of strategic alliances. And most promisingly, they looked to the immensely powerful Habsburg dynasty, rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. For a brief, tantalizing moment, it seemed they had found their savior. In a stunningly bold and defiant move against France, a marriage by proxy was arranged in 1490 between the now 13-year-old and the formidable Maximilian I of Austria, the King of the Romans and future Holy Roman Emperor. A proxy marriage was not a mere engagement. It was a real, legally binding ceremony where a nobleman stood in for the absent groom, speaking the sacred vows on his behalf. For the Breton court, gathered in Rennes Cathedral, this was a thunderous declaration of intent. It was a signal to Paris and to the world that Brittany would not bow, would not surrender its sovereignty, and had found a champion powerful enough to guarantee it. But for France, this was an act of unforgivable rebellion, a direct challenge they could not ignore. It was a move that went far beyond mere defiance. It was a strategic threat to the very security of their kingdom. King Charles VIII and his regent could not, and would not, tolerate the idea of their kingdom being strategically squeezed between a hostile, Habsburg-controlled empire to the east and an independent, Habsburg-allied Brittany to the west. The French reaction was as swift as it was brutal. Their patience had vanished, replaced by cold, calculated fury. French armies, larger and more determined than before, marched back into Brittany. This time, their objective was not merely to threaten or to skirmish, but to conquer and to subjugate once and for all. They systematically swept through the duchy until they laid siege to the city of Rennes, the very heart of the Breton resistance, where Anne herself was holding out. As the siege dragged on through the harsh, unforgiving winter, the situation grew desperate. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. Hope began to curdle into despair. Anne's allies, including her new, distant husband Maximilian, managed to send some troops and funds, but it was a pittance against the overwhelming might of the French war machine. The teenage duchess was trapped. Her city was starving. Her husband was hundreds of miles away, entangled in his own conflicts and unable to reach her. Her duchy, the land she was born to rule and protect, was about to collapse around her. The desperate gamble had failed spectacularly. Trapped within the cold, stone walls of her besieged capital, with the gaunt, despairing faces of her starving people haunting her every waking moment, Duchess Anne had to face the terrible, crushing truth. She had shown a strength and resolve that defied her years, rallying her advisors and inspiring her soldiers with her own courage. But courage, she was learning the hard way, could not feed a city, and the will of a teenage girl could not, on its own, hold back the full, overwhelming power of the French kingdom. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. Surrender was coming, a dark cloud on the horizon that could no longer be ignored. The only question that remained was what form this ultimate humiliation would take. King Charles VIII of France was a canny political operator. He and his counselors knew that simply conquering Brittany with the sword was not a permanent solution. Occupying a resentful and rebellious nation was costly, unstable, and would invite foreign interference. The treaty her father had been forced to sign was not enough. He had to lock down the duchy for good, to bind it so tightly to France that it could never again dream of breaking away. And he knew that the only way to do that was to chain it directly to the French crown through the unbreakable, sacred bonds of marriage. His terms were as brilliant as they were cruel, a masterstroke of political coercion. He forced Anne to agree to the annulment of her legal and binding proxy union with Maximilian I, and to marry him instead. The document she was forced to agree to was not a marriage contract celebrating a new union. It was an annexation notice with a wedding date attached. It contained a clause of such chilling foresight that it can only be described as a dynastic prison, a cage built for generations. It stated that Anne would marry Charles, and that if he were to die without a male heir, she was legally obligated to marry his successor. This clause was designed to close every possible door to Breton independence, ensuring that one way or another, through her body and the bodies of her children, Brittany would inevitably be absorbed by the French monarchy. On December 6, 1491, in a rushed, gloomy, and altogether joyless ceremony at the Château de Languilles in the Loire Valley, the 14-year-old Anne of Brittany became the wife of King Charles VIII of France. It was a union born not of affection or even of mutual political convenience, but of pure, undisguised coercion. She walked to the altar not as a joyful bride, but as a political hostage, the living symbol of her nation's defeat. To make the humiliation absolute, the Pope, under immense political pressure from the French crown, later officially annulled her first marriage to Maximilian, and Anne was forced to publicly declare that she had married Charles willingly, of her own free will. It was a lie, plain and simple, a piece of political theater designed to give the veneer of legitimacy to an act of conquest. As a final symbolic blow, Charles even forbade her from using her own title, the one that was hers by birthright. She was no longer Duchess of Brittany. She was merely Queen of France. For her people, the war was over. For Anne, her own private battle for survival had just begun. As Queen of France, Anne's new life was a gilded cage. She was adorned with the finest silks and jewels, crowned with all the pomp and solemn ceremony her new rank demanded. But she was a queen in name only, a prisoner of her own title. Charles kept a firm, unyielding grip on the administration of Brittany, ruling it not as his wife's inheritance, but as a conquered territory. Anne's every move was watched, her every word scrutinized by the suspicious, unwelcoming eyes of the French court. She was an outsider, the embodiment of a conquered enemy. The tension and resentment at the very beginning of their marriage was so thick, it was legendary. It is said that she brought 2 separate beds with her to the wedding, a silent, defiant protest against the man she was forced to share her life with, a clear signal that this was a union of state, not of heart. Her entire existence, her value at court, her very reason for being, was brutally boiled down to a single, biological function: to produce a male heir for France. Her womb became a political battlefield, the focus of the entire kingdom. Her pregnancies were not private joys or sorrows, but grave matters of state that held the futures of 2 nations in the balance. A son would solidify France's claim on Brittany forever, extinguishing the last embers of hope for its independence. A daughter, or worse, no children at all, would leave the future dangerously uncertain. For the next 7 agonizing years, she was almost constantly pregnant, her body subjected to the relentless, punishing cycle of hope and loss. She gave birth to several children, including a dauphin, a male heir named Charles Orlando, on whom the hopes of the entire kingdom rested. But a terrible and persistent tragedy haunted the royal nursery. One by one, every single one of her children with Charles died in infancy or early childhood. Charles Orlando, the precious heir, the boy who was to unite the 2 realms, succumbed to measles just 3 years after his birth. With each tiny coffin, with each devastating, soul-crushing loss, the future of the French throne, and Anne's own slim, secret hope for a separate, independent Brittany, grew dimmer and more distant. She was the Queen of France, surrounded by the trappings of immense power, but she was also a profoundly grieving mother, isolated and utterly alone in a foreign court, married to a man who remained, in her heart, her enemy and her people's conqueror. Then, in the year 1498, the unthinkable happened. A random, bizarre accident of fate changed everything. King Charles VIII, still a young man of 28, died suddenly after violently striking his head on a stone lintel of a doorway while on his way to watch a tennis match. He left behind no sons, no heirs to inherit his kingdom. According to the ironclad, inescapable marriage contract she had been forced to sign 7 years earlier, and was now a widow. But she was not free. She was still a prisoner of that treaty, obligated by its cruel terms to marry the next man to sit on the throne of France. The moment King Charles VIII was declared dead, Anne of Brittany moved with a speed and decisiveness that stunned the French court. The scared, defeated teenager who had been forced into a humiliating marriage 7 years prior was gone. In her place stood a 21-year-old woman, a hardened survivor who had endured immense personal tragedy and had spent years at the very center of French power, observing, learning, and patiently waiting. She did not linger to mourn the man who had been her captor. With astonishing haste, she immediately packed her belongings, left the royal court, and took the road back to her homeland. She went straight back to Brittany and, with an authority that left no room for argument, took up her rightful place as its sovereign ruler. This was not a mere symbolic gesture. It was a profound political act of reclamation. She re-established her own independent chancellery and government in Nantes. She began minting new coins bearing her own name and image, a fundamental assertion of sovereignty that sent a clear message across Europe. She summoned her own ruling council, the Estates of Brittany, and began to govern as the independent leader she was always meant to be. For the first time in 7 long years, she was home, and she was in command. But the contract, that ghost from her past, still hung over her head. The new king was Louis XII, Charles's older cousin. And according to that damnable treaty, to keep his claim on Brittany, he had to marry Anne. However, fate had dealt Anne a crucial, unexpected advantage. Louis XII was already married to a woman named Joan of France. To marry Anne, he would first need to get a papal annulment, a notoriously slow, complex, and politically fraught process. This delay gave in two things she desperately needed: precious time to re-establish her authority in Brittany, and more importantly, leverage. When the annulment, fueled by Louis's intense political maneuvering, finally came through and agreed to the marriage. But this time, she was not a defeated child accepting terms of surrender. She was a sharp, experienced political operator negotiating from a position of newfound strength. She dictated the terms. The new marriage contract she negotiated was a world away from the first. Where the first treaty was an instrument of submission, this one was a document of partnership. It officially and explicitly recognized her as the ruling Duchess of Brittany. It guaranteed that the duchy would keep its own laws, traditions, and historic freedoms. And then came her masterstroke. The contract contained a critical clause that completely reshaped the future. It stipulated that the Duchy of Brittany would pass not to their firstborn child, who would inherit the French throne, but to their second-born child, male or female. This was a stroke of absolute genius. It deliberately created a legal and dynastic path for Brittany to one day become independent again, ruled by its own duke or duchess, completely separate from the king or queen of France. In January of 1499, Anne of Brittany married her second French king and became Queen of France for the second time, not as a captive, but as a queen who had negotiated her own victory. Anne's story is a powerful, unforgettable reminder that history is often shaped not by the winners who write it, but by the quiet, resilient figures who refuse to accept the hand they're dealt. Her strength transformed a life that began in political captivity into a masterclass in quiet, determined resistance. If you believe that these hidden stories of personal power and high-stakes political games are as fascinating as we do, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell for more tales of the incredible lives you've never heard of. And let us know in the comments, what other overlooked or misunderstood historical figures deserve to have their story told? Anne's second marriage was nothing like the oppressive union she had been forced into as a teenager. Louis XII seemed to possess a genuine respect and even a deep love for his formidable wife, and their union was, by all accounts, a true partnership. And, in turn, used her new, more secure influence as Queen of France for the singular good of her homeland. She fiercely defended Brittany's autonomy at every opportunity, challenging any attempts by the French court to erode its rights or ignore its ancient privileges. She became a great patron of the arts, funding works that celebrated and reinforced Brittany's unique cultural identity, commissioning tapestries and manuscripts that were a constant, visual reminder that it was not merely a part of France. Her lifelong ambition, the preservation of an independent Brittany, never wavered. In one of her last great political struggles, she fought tenaciously to have her oldest daughter and heiress, Claude, married to a foreign prince, in one final, grand attempt to pull Brittany away from France's gravitational grip forever. Ultimately, however, the king and his council overruled her, insisting Claude marry the heir to the French throne, sealing the duchy's eventual fate after her death. Anne of Brittany died in 1514, at the tragically young age of just 36. In her short, tumultuous life, she had been a duchess, a political pawn, a captive, and a queen twice over. She was forced to give up her freedom, her youth, and her own choices for the sake of her people. And while she could not, in the end, stop the inexorable tide of history that led to the eventual union of Brittany and France, her life was anything but a failure. It was a monument to resistance, a testament to what one person can endure and achieve against seemingly impossible odds. Her final wish was perhaps her most powerful and enduring statement. While her body, as befitted a queen of France, was buried in the royal basilica of Saint Denis with the kings of France, she gave a different order for her heart. She commanded that her heart be sent back home. It was sealed inside a magnificent golden reliquary, exquisitely enameled and inscribed with the words, "In this little vessel of fine gold, pure and clean, rests a heart greater than any in the world." This reliquary was taken on a solemn procession back to Brittany to be buried in the tomb of her parents in Nantes. It was a final, symbolic act of defiance and devotion from the child queen who was forced to marry her executioner, but who never, for a single moment, stopped being the Duchess of Brittany. Her heart, just like her legacy, belonged forever to her people.